And then we want to think about the story, the lead up to the giving of the Torah, how it's described, its aftermath. But we also want to focus on the name, because the name is interesting, because we refer to it by a name of somebody who's maybe even not Jewish. It's a disagreement who Jethro was. In other words, what was his spiritual state? Did he convert? Did he not convert? There are different customs. There are different opinions. But in any case, you would think you would find a word that describes the actual giving of the Torah, which seems more important than just Jethro coming to the camp, which is a wonderful thing, but it's not like the most critical, important thing in the parsha. So that's what we one of the things we want to focus on. We share the screen as usual, and we begin with the parsha in a nutshell. So Moses' father-in-law Jethro hears of the great miracles which God performed for the people of Israel, and comes from Midian to the Israelite camp, bringing with him Moses' wife and 2 sons. Jethro advises Moshe to appoint a hierarchy of magistrates and judges to assist him in the task of governing and administering justice to the people. Right, so there's this great, beautiful description of Moshe, where Jethro sees all the people standing, lining up for Moshe to provide judgment and counsel, and he says, "Terrible idea. You need to delegate," and that's what happens, as the Torah describes in great detail. The children of Israel camp opposite Mount Sinai, where they are told that God has chosen them to be His kingdom of priests and holy nation. The people respond by proclaiming, "All that God has spoken, we shall do." On the 6th day of the 3rd month of Sivan, 7 weeks after the Exodus, the entire nation of Israel assembles to the foot of Mount Sinai for the giving of the Torah. God descends on the mountain amidst thunder, lightning, billows of smoke, and the blast of the shofar, and summons Moses to ascend. God proclaims the 10 commandments, commanding the people of Israel to believe in God, not to worship idols, or take God's name in vain, to keep the Shabbat, honor their parents, not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal, and not to bear false witness or covet.
I just got on Rabbi Feldman's class. I forgot. It was at 10 o'clock.
The people cry out to Moses that the revelation is too intense for them to bear, begging him to receive the Torah from God and to convey it to them. So the response is actually not, the people say, "Oh, we want more." They were overwhelmed at the revelation of Sinai, and they say, "We don't want to hear from God directly. We want to hear from Moses." So maybe we'll talk about that as well. So that's the portion in a nutshell. We want to begin at the beginning, which is what we usually do. So just to think about the basic question, let's just open up the text here. We open up the text. Okay, so this is the first reading. Now Moses' father-in-law Jethro, the chieftain of Midian, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, that the Lord has taken Israel out of Egypt. So Jethro hears the news, he hears what happened, and he's motivated to come to the Jewish camp. So the verse continues. So Moses' father-in-law Jethro took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after she had been sent away. What does it mean after she has been sent away? So the verse, the commentaries explain that if you look earlier in the Torah, in the beginning of the portion, the portion of Shemot, and the portion of Exodus, the first portion in the book of Exodus, you read that when God told Moshe to go to Egypt, Moshe takes his wife and his sons. So we know that Moshe actually starts going to Egypt with his wife Zipporah and her sons, and his sons and their sons. So the question becomes, how come now, after the Exodus, all of a sudden, Zipporah is with her father in Midian? What happened? Right, so if you look, I'm just looking quickly over here. If you want to look, you don't have to look, but if you want to look at Exodus chapter 4, verse 20. If you have a stone, it's on page 311. So Moses took his wife and his sons, mounted them on the donkey, and returned to the land of Egypt. So we know that they went to Egypt. They went toward Egypt. So what happened? So the Medrash explains that Moshe, the next page it reads that Moshe met his brother Aaron. And his brother Aaron says, where are you We're going to Egypt. Wonderful. But why are you bringing your family to Egypt? We have enough Jews suffering in Egypt. We don't need more Jews suffering in Egypt. So Moshe sends them home. So they missed the whole experience. They missed the Ten Commandments. They missed the Exodus. They missed the splitting of the sea. But now, when Jethro wants to come to the camp, he brings Tzipporah and her sons. So that is just to figure out where Tzipporah was, where she was at the time. The bigger question becomes, and this is a little bit not clear, is when did this story take place? So usually we like to think about the Torah, that the Torah is written in chronological order as the events develop. And that's what we usually do, unless there's a reason to say otherwise. If there's a reason to say otherwise, we could say otherwise. In other words, the rule is, the sages say the Torah is not written in chronological order. That's what the sages say, which means it does not have to be written in chronological order. Sometimes the Torah makes a change for a certain specific reason. And this may be an example. Why do we say that this may be an example? So if you go back to the story, Jethro comes to Moshe. They come to the camp, they meet, they have lunch, they have dinner. Where is it? Oh, they have a whole meal. Then Moses' father-in-law Jethro sacrificed burnt offerings and peace offerings to God, and Aaron and all the elders of Israel came to dine with Moses, his father-in-law, before God. So Jethro comes, they meet up with Moshe, he thanks God, and finally they make him, and he says that he recognizes God. Verse 11 is very powerful. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the deities, for with the thing that they plotted, he came upon them. And they have the meal. By the way, let's stop here for a second. Now I know that God is greater than all the deities. What exactly was Jethro's philosophical perspective in life? So earlier, the Torah keeps referring to Jethro, and he does so too here, the chieftain of Midian. Chieftain of Midian is leader of Midian, but the word says, the verse says Kohen Midian. Kohen can be priest of Midian. So was he a priest of Midian? If he was a priest of Midian, doesn't priest have a connotation of a religious position? So was he the religious leader of Midian? So there are all kinds of medrashim, and it's not 100% clear, but there are many medrashim that say that Jethro was the priest of Midian. He was the chief priest. He was the expert on religion in Midian and the expert of all the idols. And he, at some point, is disillusioned by the idols. And at that point, he is no longer respected in Midian. Where do you see it? You see it that when Moses came to Midian and he saw that the shepherds were mistreating Jethro's daughters and they chased them away from the water, and Moshe came and gave water to Jethro's sheep, who were then being grazed by Jethro's daughters. So if Jethro was the leader of Midian and the priest of Midian, then it's hard to believe that his daughters would be mistreated. So that's why the Medrash says that he was the priest of Midian. He was the leader. He was the spiritual leader. But because he becomes disillusioned and he says, I don't want the job anymore, now they start mistreating him and mistreating his daughters until Moshe comes and steps in. Why is that interesting? So the Medrash says that when the verse says right here, we just read, when the verse says, when Jethro finally comes to the Jewish camp and he says, now I know that the Lord is greater than all the deities, than all the gods. How does he know the Lord is greater than all the gods? Says the Medrash, you know how he knows? Because he tried all the gods. He served every idol. He served every philosophy. He served every religion, which tells you that he's a searching person. And he was a scholar, and he was an expert in the philosophy of the times. And he says, I investigated. I was everywhere. And now I know that God is greater than everybody. So that may be an important point. We'll get to that in a minute. In any case, they come and they have dinner. Everybody sits down. Jews get together. They're going to eat. So they offer sacrifices, peace offerings, which means they get to eat some of the steak, and they eat bread. Wonderful. What happens the next morning? We turn the page. The next morning, Vayhi Macharat, it came about the next day that Moses sat down to judge the people. Moses sat down to judge the people from the morning to the night. Okay, what is Moses judging the people? Well, you say when we have a dispute, he's going to rule. Rule based on what? Could you judge before the Torah was given, before the law was given? So some people say yes, but Rashi quotes the Medrash that says, no, this story about Moshe judging the people and Jethro showing up and offering advice of how to create a proper justice system, this story actually, says Rashi, quoting the Medrash, this story did not happen in chronological order. It's not the next morning after Jethro came. And because it would make no sense to be that it would be the next morning, because the next morning, what is Moshe judging? What are we judging based of? So Rashi says the next morning is actually months away. And he says the next morning is the day after Yom Kippur. Now, without getting into all the math, why do we say Yom Kippur? So the reason why we're saying Yom Kippur is because Moshe got the Torah. As soon as he got the Torah on Shavuot, which is basically in the beginning of the middle of the spring. So usually it's May or June, if you want to think about it in the English calendar. Then the next morning he goes up for 40 days. 40 days later, he comes down, the people are serving the idols. He shatters the tablets, goes back up for another 40 days, comes back down, says God forgave, goes back up, comes back down 40 days later. So it's 3 sets of 40. And he comes down on Yom Kippur with the second set of tablets. There was no time for Moshe to sit and judge the people from when the Torah was given until Yom Kippur. Okay? So Rashi says that when the verse says it was on the next day, it doesn't mean the next day after Jethro came. It means the next day after Yom Kippur. In other words, this happened many portions later, toward the end of the book of Exodus. This whole system where Moshe is judging and alone, and Jethro says, why are you judging alone? You have to incorporate other people to help. You have to have a whole hierarchy. So so it's really written out of order. So why is it written out of order? Right? In other words, so the conventional interpretation is, well, once we're talking about Jethro showing up, we want to just give you the whole story of Jethro, even though it's out of order, because the second half, what happened the next day is really months later after the giving of the Torah. But if that's the case, why is it written here? There has to be a deeper meaning. So we're going to try to get to that in a second. Right, but just to read a little bit, just to get the feel of what Jethro's piece of advice is as follows. When Moses' father-in-law saw, I came about the next day, that Moses sat down to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from the morning until the evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw what he was doing to the people, making everybody wait on long lines, he said, what is this thing that you are doing to the people? Why do you sit by yourself while all the people stand before you from morning till evening? Moses said to his father-in-law, for the people come to me to see God. If any of them has a case, he comes to me, and I judge between a man and his neighbor, and I make known the statutes of God and his teachings. Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people who are with you, for the matter is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me, I will advise you, and may the Lord be with you. You represent the people before God, and you shall bring the matters to God, and you shall admonish them concerning the statutes and the teachings, and you shall make known to them the way that they shall go and the deeds that they shall do. But you shall choose out of the entire people, entire nation, men of substance, God-fearers, men of truth who hate humanitary gain, and you shall appoint over Israel, leaders over thousands, leaders over hundreds, leaders over 50s, leaders over 10s, and they shall judge the people at all times. And it shall be that any major matter they shall bring to you, and they themselves shall judge every minor matter, thereby making it easier for you, and they shall bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, and the Lord commands you, you will be able to survive, and also all this people will come upon their people in peace. And we turn the page and we read how Moshe does so. Moses obeyed his father-in-law and did all that he said, as the Torah describes. And here's another strange verse. Moses saw his father-in-law off, and he went away to his land. When did he go away? When did he come? When did the story happen? There's a lot of confusion. But let's stick with Rashi. And Rashi, we're going to assume that Jethro comes before the giving of the Torah. Then the Torah was given. Then you have 4 sets of 40 days. And after the 4 sets of 40 days, Moshe sits down after Yom Kippur. Finally, we got the second tablets. We could start going back to normal life And he says, okay, anybody have any court cases? And all of a sudden, it's like after COVID when the courts were closed and everything is backed up. You open up after 120 days of no courts, there's a long line. And then Jethro says, this is crazy. You can't have one judge for hundreds of thousands of people. You have to have a hierarchy of judges and bring other people involved. And Moshe says, what a wonderful idea. Okay, so let's assume that happened after the giving of the Torah. What is that? So what are we left with? So why does the Torah put this story as an introduction to the giving of the Torah? Why does the Torah tell the story before the Torah was given instead of the chronological order? So the technical answer is because, again, once we're talking about Moses, once we're talking about Jethro, so we'll say everything that happened with Jethro. But there's a Kabbalistic interpretation and a Hasidic interpretation that is much deeper. And the Hasidic interpretation is as follows. When we think about the Torah in general, which is what we want to talk about today because it's the time of the giving of the Torah, the Torah is unlike any other religion, holy book. How so? Because usually religion means revelation. Every religion is predicated on the fact that God reveals his will to the people. Like Maimonides says, one of the principles of faith is that there's prophecy. He coins it, he says it in the terms of, it's a principle of faith to believe that God makes his will known to people. So every religion has a tradition, or whatever the case is, a story that God tells people what to do. And that's what religion is all about. And Judaism is very different. Why is Judaism very different? Which is why I like to say Judaism is not a religion. First of all, grabs people's attention, so it's always fun to say, but it's true. So it also happens to be true. It's not a religion in the conventional sense. Religion is God is coming to the people and telling them his will. Now that's partially true, but that's not the whole story. Where do you see that in the Torah? In the Torah, there is the dual system of the written Torah and the oral Torah. The written Torah is the 5 books of Moses, and the oral Torah is the interpretation. And the people have the power to interpret the verses. And that's what all of Talmud, all of Jewish literature, all of Jewish scholarship is how we interpret the Torah. And very often, the way we interpret the Torah is very different than the literal meaning of the Torah. And there are thousands of examples. There almost is not an example of a mitzvah in the written Torah that is not subject to analysis and interpretation and application by the oral Torah. So if the Torah says, the famous example, that if you harm somebody, it's an eye for an eye or a hand for an hand. Well, the oral Torah says, sorry, that's not the interpretation. Instead, it means not literal, it's non-literal, it's monetary compensation. But that's one example. There are thousands of examples. Why? Because the Torah's idea is that the Torah is it's not a religion, it's not a book of God coming and making his will known to the people, but really what the Torah is a way to bond with God. And to bond with God, there has to be a partnership. And a partnership means that both parties contribute. That God gives us, in the written Torah, gives us his perspective, but he wants to hear our perspective. And only when you have the merging of the written Torah and the oral Torah do you truly get the will of God. So what is the will of God? Well, it depends how the people understand it. Of course, within the parameters that the Torah gives us. So there's a beautiful story in the Talmud that there's a debate between the sages, and the sage who's in the minority wants to prove his point. So he says, well, if I'm right, then miracles will start happening. And he starts naming the miracles. And he says that, what does he say? He says that the water in the stream outside will flow the other way. It's one miracle. And he says the walls will shake. And he gives all these kinds of miracles that happen, and they all happen. And the majority of the rabbis say, sorry, we're not impressed by the miracles because the Torah says, Lo b'shamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven. Torah was given to people to learn and apply and rule according to majority. So we're not listening to God, the miracles. Finally, a voice comes from heaven. And the voice says, listen to Rabbi Eliezer, the halacha is according to him. And they say, sorry, we don't listen to voices from heaven because the Torah has to be applied on earth. And they reject the voice from heaven and they follow the majority. And the Talmud then continues, and he says that later there was a sage who saw Elijah the prophet. And he tells Elijah the prophet, so what does God do? What was God's reaction when the people rejected the voice from heaven? Wasn't God offended? right? Imagine if you're God and you went out of your way to make the miracles and give a voice from the heavens saying, endorsing the minority opinion, the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and all the other sages are basically ignoring God. So what does God do? He must be furious. So the Talmud says, no, that Elijah says, what was God doing? God was laughing and he's saying, my sons were victorious over me. My sons were victorious over me. He was very happy. In other words, that's the design. That's what the Torah is. The Torah is not God. It's not only God coming and telling you his will. It's that too. But it's also the participation of the human being. And that's why it's much more like a marriage than just like a teacher, God telling the pupil what to do and waiting for the pupil to accept, or like a servant serving the master. We have those elements in the relationship as well. But the Torah is the partnership, is the union, is the marriage, which is why the sages say, that the giving of the Torah was like the wedding day, the wedding between God and the Jewish people. Okay, if that's the case, that the Torah is about the partnership between God and the people, if that's the case, then we understand why even before the Torah was given, we want to highlight Jethro and his contribution. Because what are we showing? We're showing that part of the Torah system was instituted and brought by the people, by Jethro, not by God, not even by Moses, by an outsider. And yet that can be incorporated into the system of the Torah. And more importantly, the whole idea that you have not Moshe, who's the prophet, who's going to tell you the will of God, but you have many judges, what that does is allows for the human voice to interpret the law that Moshe is giving. And therefore, even before you get the Torah, you have to hear about that. You have to hear about this notion that the Torah is not just God telling you his will. It's not only that, it's that too. We'll discuss that too. But it's not only that. It's also that we invest ourselves and we try to understand it and we try to define and determine the will of God. And it's the partnership between the two. And that happens in the judicial process. And that's why the judges, it doesn't say who, doesn't have to be a unique person. You don't have to be a priest. You don't have to be a Levite. Anybody who acquires the knowledge, who wants to invest in the knowledge and study, is able to participate in the discussions of the Torah. And ultimately, if you can convince everybody to follow you, the law will follow you as well. So the point here is that the reason why the story of the judges precedes the giving of the Torah, because this is going to give us the full understanding of what the Torah is. It's not a book of laws, it's that too, but it's also the marriage and the partnership between God and the Jewish people. And that's why we hear about this even before the Torah was given, because this will give us an understanding of what the Torah is telling us. So that is point number one, giving us the introduction of why we start with Jethro's contribution to the judicial system, especially if you follow Rashi, which is basically it's out of chronological order. Okay, so let's think about this for a second, just to analyze a little bit more what Jethro was doing, what Jethro is offering. And there's an obvious question that many people ask, and that is, why is it that Jethro's solution or suggestion actually seems pretty obvious? And that raises the question, why doesn't Moshe think about it on his own? Right? The idea that you have one person doing everything alone is a bad idea and you should delegate seems to be obvious, and God agrees with it at the end. So the question becomes, why doesn't Moshe think about it? And there are all kinds of answers that are offered. There are all kinds of answers offered as to why Moshe does not suggest this. I'm just trying to think which ones we want to think about. Just to offer one, just on a basic level, of what's the problem with delegation? The problem with delegation, the reason why delegating is so hard, especially if you are good at what you do, is that you feel that you can do it better. It's not that you want to do everything. We're not talking about someone who's a control freak who wants to do everything. The reason why I want to do everything is because I will do a better and more efficient job. So it's actually easier to do it by yourself rather than train other people who are not going to do the job just as good. Another simple example, tell my kids to clean their room. Well, it's actually quicker for me to clean their room myself than to convince them or negotiate with them or encourage them to clean their room, which then I'm going to have to clean it anyway because they don't do such a great job to begin with, right? So in other words, the hesitance to delegate is, why would I delegate if it could be done better and in a better way through Moshe himself. And what's the mistake? It's not just delegate because for practical reasons. You, like Jethro says, you're simply not able to do it alone. It takes too much effort. So it's not just delegate because there's a practical need, but there's a much deeper idea of why Moshe should delegate. And the deeper idea is because what is the purpose? The purpose, if the purpose is to get it done, then maybe you can do it by yourself. But what about if the purpose is actually to get other people on board with your vision? In that case, the purpose is not to get the room clean. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to teach your child the value and the appreciation of and the responsibility of cleaning their own room. If that's the purpose, to get the other person to understand and see the beauty and the vision and the responsibility of what you want them to do, if that's the case, then you can't do it alone, because you do it alone, it's top down. You're just giving them a gift, and they're not getting invested, and they're not invested in the process, and they're not invested in the project. So if the purpose is to educate, if the purpose is to get people invested in the project, then doing it alone, even if you do a better job, is actually not the best idea, because here you have an opportunity to get other people involved. And that connects to what we mentioned earlier, that the purpose of the Torah is not just to know the word of God, right? Moshe keeps saying, the people come to me to know the word of God. Okay, fine. That's one idea of the Torah. But part of the Torah is to get people involved in the process, to ask the questions, to give the answers, to debate this in the tools of the oral Torah, which is human logic, to invest human logic to try to understand the word of God and to contribute their own perspective. So if that's the case, you want to get as many people as possible as involved, even if maybe they won't be as great as scholars as Moses. So in that sense, Moses' vision is Moses is almost like the conduit of God's will. So Moses is the prophet. His job is to bring God's perspective. But Jethro says the purpose is not only to bring God's perspective, the purpose is to bring the human perspective. And therefore, you have to get other people involved. And the same is true in our life. We like to do things because sometimes we like to do it by ourselves because we'll do a better job. But the question is, are you trying to get the job done? Or are you trying to get the people in your family or on your team or in your company to buy into the vision? And they're not going to buy into the vision. They're not going to invest themselves in the vision unless they have a part in forming it and investing in doing it their way. And that's what Jethro sees, and that's what Jethro tells Moshe, and that's Jethro's contribution. And that's why that's critical to Torah study, because that's the model of Torah study. We have the word of God, but it's reflected, but it's understood and elaborated upon by the human knowledge, by the human contribution. So that is a little bit about Jethro. Now we want to jump around a little bit, and I think that we want to talk about the Torah. And so we want to talk about the essence of the Torah and why we study Torah. And we talked about this a little bit on Fridays when we talked about the Tanya, but I think it's good to spend a few minutes on this. So we want to jump to the Ten Commandments when God speaks the Ten Commandments. And the opening of the Ten Commandments, the opening statement would be, let's see the opening statement. So God descends on Mount Sinai, okay, to Exodus chapter 20. God spoke all these words to respond. Okay, another story. I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So there's so much to say, but let's start with the first word. Let's start with I, Anochi. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am the Lord your God, which is the first word of the Ten Commandments. Now, what does Anochi mean? So Anochi means I. The interesting thing is that in biblical Hebrew, there are different ways to say I. The more common word for I, and in modern Hebrew, it's certainly more common, is Ani. Ani is I. You say in the prayer in the morning, the first prayer says, Modeh Ani, I offer thanks, or offer thanks I. Ani is I. And here we have another word which is much less common, even though it does appear in the Torah, but it's less common, and it is Anochi. So Anochi is actually spelled Ani with the Chaf. So it's actually the same word, but with an extra letter. One extra letter gets you from Ani to Anochi. And the question is why we use the term Anochi and what is the difference between Ani and Anochi? And there are all kinds of different interpretations. In fact, one interpretation is that Anochi is actually not Hebrew. They say Anochi is Egyptian. That's what the Medrash says. Now, if you look at Semitic languages, you see that all of the Semitic languages use the same few letters to say Ani. In Arabic, it's Ana. We say Ani, it's Ana. And then you have the people that study these things. They say in Aramaic it's Ana, but in other Semitic languages it's Anak. Anak is Anochi. You get the chaf. So basically, this could be true that when you say Anochi, you're getting a broader audience. You're not just speaking Hebrew, but you're speaking in the language of the surrounding peoples as well. That's one interpretation that the Medrash says. And the idea here is that the 10 Commandments or the values of the Torah are really universal. So lest the Jewish people think that it's just for them, as opposed to them being the messengers who have to bring it to the rest of the world. So the first word of the 10 Commandments is Anochi. Anochi is not strictly Hebrew. It's the word that the other Semitic languages use, or like the Medrash says, Lashon Mitzri, it's Egyptian. And to tell you that the audience of the Torah is much broader. Our job is to make the Torah universal, to bring its message to everybody. And just to jump in, and that's also why some people say, why the name of the parsha is Jethro, Yisro. Right? What does that tell you? Jethro comes to hear the giving of the Torah. Who's Jethro? Well, he's not part of the Jewish people. He's coming from Midian. Why is the giving of the Torah, the portion of the giving of the Torah named with the name Jethro, Yisro? Because who's the audience of the Torah? The audience of the Torah is Yisro. The audience of the Torah is all of humanity. So that's emphasized both, according to this Medrash, it's emphasized both with the word that the Torah uses to begin the 10 Commandments, Anochi, I, but not I in Hebrew, I in a way that all the surrounding nations will understand, Anochi. And also, like I said, some people say that's also why we emphasize that Jethro comes, and we name the entire parsha Jethro, because Jethro represents the priest of Midian, the culture of Midian, the surrounding cultures. The purpose of the Torah ultimately is to affect not just the Jewish people, but the entirety of humanity. So that's one interpretation. Now we want to get a little other interpretations. The difference between Ani and Anochi. Like I said, Ani is more common. 10 Commandments begins with Anochi. And here you have so many interpretations. There's every perspective in Torah offers its interpretation, from Kabbalistic to, there's so many different interpretations. Just for the fun, I'm going to throw in the Kabbalistic interpretation. The Kabbalistic interpretation is that we know there's 10 sefirot, 10 divine attributes. And above the 10 divine attributes is what the Kabbalah refers to as the keter, the crown. And the crown is sort of the essence of the person, the will and the pleasure. So Anochi is I. When I say I, what do I mean? There's the external part of me and the essential part of me. So the Torah wants to say, when God says, I took you out of Egypt, it's my essence. So according to the Kabbalah, that's why you have Anochi. What extra letter in Anochi? Anochi is Ani with the Chaf. What is Chaf? Chaf is 20. Chaf is a numerical value of 20, but let's leave that alone. Chaf is the first letter of Keter, crown. So Ani, God is talking to us, saying, I am the Lord your God. What's I? Who's the I? The external I or the essential I? It's the essential I. And it's alluded to by the fact that it's not just the 10 sefirot talking. In other words, it's not just the way the person is projected in his ideas and in his emotions, but it's the crown. And the crown is the Kabbalistic way of saying the essence that hovers above. So the essence of God is talking to us. So I just see how the Chaf could be Keter, because Chaf is the first letter of the word Keter, crown. So that's just the Kabbalistic perspective. All I'm trying to do is tell you that everybody has something to say about this. So one interpretation that I like, a very practical interpretation, is from the Malbim, 19th century commentator, and he says as follows. He says that when you say I, there's two ways to say I. You could say I as relating to something else. Anytime you say I as relating to something else, you would say Ani. I'm going on a walk. I am talking to you. I am thinking, right? It's always I relating to something else. That's when you say ani. Says the Malbim, anochi, which is almost more formal. In some sense, it's more formal. But anochi is I, not the way I'm doing something. It's I for myself. It's my essential self. Similar to what the Kabbalah says, it just says it in different words. Instead of using the terms keter, crown, it says, am I relating to something? And if I'm relating to something, is that your true essence? I'm going on a train. So is that your true essence? That's what you do? You go on a train? No, it's just a practical thing. You happen to be going on a train, right? It's not your essence. Is your essence involved, or is just the way you're interacting? It's just the external part of you interacting with the environment around you. That's when you say ani. But if you're talking about the essence, what do you really stand for? That's anochi. And that's what he says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm the Lord your God. The relationship between God and the people touches the essence of God. It's not just the external part of God. In other words, God is invested in our relationship, in a relationship with us, not just in the externality of God, but also his essence. So that's what the message of Anochi. But now I'm going to give you a Talmudic interpretation that the Hasidic philosophy spins just a little bit, just enough to be able to give us some beautiful teachings. So the Talmud says that Anochi is an acronym. What is the acronym? The acronym is Ana Nafshi Ktavit Yehavit. Now it depends how you read this. The conventional way of reading this is Ana, I, Nafshi, my soul, I wrote and I gave. That's the acronym of Anochi. I, my soul, I wrote, I gave. Meaning that God himself says, I wrote the Torah and I gave you the Torah. So that's the conventional interpretation of that Midrash. The Hasidic interpretation says, let's read this literally. What is God saying? I, my soul, I wrote and I gave. I invested my soul in the Torah. I wrote it down. I wrote down my soul on paper or on parchment or on stone in that case, and I gave it to you. So what does that mean? That means that when we study Torah, what are we getting? Are we getting just an idea, a book of rules? Like before you get your driver's permit, you have to read the rules of the road. That's what you're getting. You're getting a technical guide to life. Or, says the Hasidic interpretation, you're getting God's soul. Because God says, I wrote my soul into the Torah. And this opens up another whole interpretation of why we study Torah and what we're trying to do when we study Torah. So God invests within his Torah, his wisdom and his will. And when we study Torah, as we discussed on the other day in Tanya chapter 5, when we study Torah, what we're really doing is we're actually uniting with the essence and soul of God that is existing in the Torah. When we grasp an idea of the Torah, we're really grasping God himself, which explains a very interesting phenomenon in the Torah. In the Torah, there are many laws that are discussed and elaborated, and a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about them, but they're completely impractical. In fact, the Talmud itself says about some laws, it is impossible for this law to take place. So the question is, if it's impossible for this law to take place, why are we spending so much time studying laws that are impossible to happen? May happen, maybe will happen, but it's not practical cases. So if you're studying Torah and your idea is, I need to know what to do, then you're reading the wrong book, because yes, the Torah also has instructions of what to do, but it's not only, it also has instructions that are theoretical cases. In fact, so much of the Torah today are things that we cannot do because we're not living in temple times. So why are we studying this? So there's multiple interpretations, but the Kabbalistic interpretation is, when we study a law, we're not just trying to figure out what to do if two people are disputing and fighting over a dollar. One guy says that's not mine, the other person says it's his, so what do we do with the dollar? That's not what Torah study is all about. I mean, it's that too. It also tells you what to do in any given case. But what's really happening here is, when we study Torah, we're connecting to God's wisdom. We want to know, what does God's wisdom dictate in this scenario? And when we understand that, we're grasping God's wisdom. And we're grasping God's wisdom in a very deep way. And that is the bond that happens through study of Torah. So the study of Torah is not just utilitarian to know what to do. If it would, for example, we would probably bury the Talmud and just follow the code of law, because the code of law is basically telling you what to do. But the Talmud is a discussion and the debate, and debating cases that are not practical. And some of the cases are actually very theoretical. But that's not the point. The point is not what to do in this scenario. It's that too. But the point is you want to bond with God. And God invested his essence in the Torah. And that goes back to the acronym that the Talmud says that Anochi, I, is an acronym for I, my soul, I wrote into the Torah and I gave into the Torah. So that is just something to think about when you think about study of Torah and you come to a Talmud class and you say, okay, it's a wonderful case, but how practical is this? Do I really need to know this? Do I really need to know this? Like my kids tell me every day, they come home and say, do I really need to know this? I don't think I'm ever going to use this information. So, well, it depends. If it's, first of all, they're probably going to need it, but that's a separate question. But it's possible, yes, if you're learning a secular subject and you're never going to use it again, well, maybe it's not the best use of your time, unless you just want to exercise your mind, but for that you can play chess. But if you are studying in order to bond with God because you want to think the way God thinks, you want to be able to grasp God's way of thinking, then whether or not this case actually plays out is completely secondary to the question of the bond that happens with God when we study the Torah. So that's just something about the word Anochi, the word I. We have a few more minutes. We can talk about many things, but I think we're already on the 10 Commandments. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about the 10 Commandments because I guess they're important if they're in the top 10. So I guess we could talk about them a little bit. Of course, I feel like anybody want to comment or ask a question or divert our attention elsewhere, please do. Oh, wonderful. Doctor, please go ahead. And then we'll get back to the commandments. Go ahead. We don't hear you, so I think you have to unmute.
You're right. My question goes back to Jethro. Since he was the chief, call him a philosopher, call him a philosopher of the pagan religions, was he converted? And when he went back, sorry?
That's a discussion. It's not clear. There's different medrashim. Some medrashim says he converted, and when he goes back to his people later on, and here it says he went back to his people as we saw, but in the book of Numbers, it's written again that Moshe says, why did you come to us? And we want you to come with us to Israel and we'll do good to you. And he says, no, I'm going back to my land. So there's two ways of reading it. One opinion is that he says, I'm not interested. He doesn't convert. Another interpretation is that he says, I'm going back to my land so I can convert the people of my land. In other words, spread the teachings of Torah to the people of my land. So it's not clear. It's not clear.
But would you have expected him to have gotten circumcised then?
Well, maybe he did. Maybe he did. In other words, the rabbis are trying to convert him. In other words, there are many midrashim that say that that he did convert. So just for example, just to show you one, let's jump back. He shows up. Where is it? Verse 7. So Moses went out toward Jethro, prostrated himself and kissed him, and they greeted one another, and they entered the tent. Vayavo, and they came ha'ohala, and they entered the tent. Okay. Now this is first of all, why do you have to say they entered the tent? Where did they sleep? They slept on the floor? Of course they slept in the tent. Of course they entered the tent. But the Torah says they entered the tent. That's not my biggest problem. My biggest problem is the way you say the tent is ha'ohel. To say ha'ohala is totally an extra hey, making it feminine. It's just not the way you say it. The tent ha'ohel. Instead, it says ha'ohel with a hey. So commentaries explain that it alludes to they came to the tent of hay, the tent of Hashem, the tent of God. They came to the tent of God. They entered the tent of God is the figurative term that's describing the conversion. All I'm trying to say is that some midrashim say, some of the sages say that he did convert. Others say he didn't. What do I think? Well, I wasn't there. So I don't know if he converted. But what I do know is the Torah does not say he converted. So what does that tell me? That tells me that at least in the simple surface level, the Torah is saying, speak to Jethro. Jethro has to be inspired by the Torah. He does not have to convert. What does that sound like? That sounds like Judaism's message to the rest of the world. Judaism's message is that the Torah has a universal message for everybody, but not everybody has to be Jewish, because the Torah doesn't believe that there's one path for everybody. The Torah doesn't believe that everybody has to perform 613 commandments to have a relationship with God. The Jew has to, because that's the makeup of his soul. But someone who's not Jewish should and could have a relationship with God and should and could contribute to the Torah, but they don't have to convert. They still have a connection to God by keeping the 7 Noahide laws. So what I'm reading, I know what the sages are saying, he converted. So it's possible that he converted. But I still think the Torah doesn't say he converted, because the broader message is we don't necessarily need him to convert, right? The purpose is to reach the entire world, not to convert the entire world. The purpose is that everybody hears the values of the Torah, the essential message of the Torah, which is the oneness of God. That is universal. It's part of the 7 Noahide laws. But does everybody have to eat matzah on Pesach and put on tefillin to have a relationship with God? No. And that's, of course, unique about Judaism than all other religions. All other religions basically say that this is the path to God, and if you don't join, you have no connection to God. And therefore, we love you so much, so we're going to force you to convert. And if you don't want to, we also may kill you because we love you so much. Judaism doesn't say that. Judaism says you can have a path to God even by not being Jewish. So for me, when the Torah does not say he converted, I think, oh, that's nice. That means whether or not he converted, the sages say, even if the sages are right, even if those sages are right that say he did, I'm perfectly fine for him to be converted. But I'm less interested in him. I'm more interested in what message the Torah is trying to signal.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, let's look at the Torah for a second. Let's look at the 10 Commandments for a second. And I said this in the past, but it's so nice, I'll say it again. So first of all, why were there 2 tablets? So you know the joke, which I shouldn't say because it's not nice. But the joke is like this. The joke is for this. You have to understand the joke. You have to have the background. The background is that the Medrash says that the Torah, God first went to the other nations and asked them if they wanted Torah, and they said no. Each one said no. What does it say in the Torah? So it says, oh, you can't steal. And say, nah, not for us. Then they went to another nation. No, what does it say? What does the Torah say? They say, oh, you can't commit adultery. Oh, not for us. The Torah says, don't steal, don't kill, not for us. And that's what the Medrash says. So that's the Medrash. And then, what does the Medrash mean? Did God actually go to the other nations? Not necessarily, but it means that the other nations, their cultures were opposed to the Torah, so God didn't give it to them. That's what I think it means. In any case, God then comes, so the joke is like this. God comes to the other nations and they say, do you want the Torah? They say, each one asks, what does it say? They say, no. God comes to the Jews and says, do you want the Torah? They say, how much is the cost? God says, it's free. So they say, okay, give us 2. So that's how we got the 10 Commandments. That's why we got the 2 tablets. That's the joke. Don't tell anybody I said it. Why the 2 tablets? You could save on the hardware and write all 10 commandments on one stone, and you save on your hardware. Why do you need 2 tablets? So what is the difference if you put, so let's think about the 10 commandments for a second. So one way to think about this is as follows. If you look at the 10 commandments, you will notice that generally speaking, there may be one exception, but it's not really an exception. But generally speaking, the first 5 commandments are what we call commandments between person and God. The second 5 commandments are commandments that we call between person and person and his friend. So for example, the first five commandments is to believe in one God, not to believe in other idols, not to say God's name in vain, to honor Shabbat. Okay, these are things that if I don't do any of those, I'm not offending another person. It's between me and God. Now the final one is honor your parents, which is in the first column, in the first 5, the 5 between us and God. But in any case, let's leave that aside. Let's assume honoring your parents is between you and God. If we have time, I'll get into that. So that's the first 5. First 5 is between me and God. The second 5 is between people, governs the relationship between people. Do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness against somebody else, and do not covet the other person's possessions. Those are 5 that are between people. Now I ask you, which is more important? Is it more important to do the mitzvot between man and God, or is it more important to do the mitzvot between man and man? Another person says, oh, I'm not religious. I don't keep any mitzvot, but I'm a very good person between people. I say, really? Okay, so you've basically kept at least 50% of the commandments. right? So in other words, the Torah has so many commandments between people. So which one is more important? Is it more important to have a mitzvah between me and God, or between man and man? It's more important not to serve idols or not to steal. Which one is more important? So that's an interesting philosophical question. But here's one way to think about it. If the Torah would be written, all 10 commandments would be written on one tablet in a linear way, then there's higher mitzvot and lower mitzvot. There's the firsts and there's the lasts. But if you have 10 commandments, and the 10 commandments are actually written on 2 tablets that are parallel, so we call one commandment number 1 and commandment number 6, and it's true, God did say them in that order. So they were said in that order. But the way they're written, what do we see? We see they parallel each other. Number 1 is not higher than number 6. Right? The top of one, they're side by side. If they're side by side, 5 is between man and God, and 5 is between man and man, and you put them together, which one is higher than the other? None of them. They're both the same high. They're both the same. And here, there's so many ways of interpreting this. There's so many ways of explaining what exactly do we mean by that one is not higher than the next. They're actually parallel to each other. And there are many interpretations, and we get to the point that there's so many interpretations, we get to details, and we get to the point that you could actually read the 10 commandments not from 1 to 10, but you can read it not in a linear way, but you can read it across. In other words, 1 and 6 are connected, 2 and 7 are connected, etc. We can do that if we have 2-3 minutes. But even before that, now we get to the philosophical question. And I don't want to offend anybody because there are a lot of people, smart people on both sides of this issue. But I know I think I know what Torah says is, could there be morality without a belief in a higher power, without a belief in God? Maybe what the Torah is saying is that these 2 commandments, these 2 tablets are interdependent. They're connected in the sense, it's not one higher, one lower, but they're connected, but you need to have the one to have the other. If you don't believe in a higher power, maybe there's no reason not to kill. Because who told you not to kill? Your logic? Well, maybe if your logic tomorrow tells you you should kill, maybe you should kill. Maybe you can rationalize killing. But if there's a higher power that says you can't kill, then you won't kill. So in other words, what we're trying to say is, in some sense, the tablets between a man and God and man, they parallel each other because one is not higher than the other. Each one is dependent. And now we have 4 minutes left. So with your permission, I think we did this a few years ago, but if we can run very quickly between the 10 commandments and show how they're connected, not 1 to 10, but 1 to 6 and 2 to 5, 2 to 7, because they're really across each other. So instead of reading, I'm the Lord your God is one, and the second one is don't serve idols, read I'm the Lord your God, and the next one, the same line is do not kill. Okay, what's the connection between I'm the Lord your God and do not kill? You see what I'm saying? If I'm not clear, please stop me right now, because then the next 4 minutes are not going to be clear. So if I'm not clear, let me know. But I think it's clear. We have 2 tablets. 2 tablets are parallel to each other. So the first commandment on tablet number 1 is just like this. On one of the tablets has to be read with the first tablet, with the first commandment on the second tablet. In simple English, commandment 1 and commandment 6 are connected. So what's commandment 1? Do not kill. I'm sorry, sir. Okay. Do not kill. 6. Number 1 is do not. I'm the Lord your God. Belief in one God. What's the connection between belief in one God and not killing? Could I not believe in one God and kill? Like, what's the connection? So there are multiple ways of explaining this, but we're just going to run through this quickly. And I don't remember who. I think it's the Kli Yakar who says this. Why can't we kill? Why can't we kill? Maybe we should kill. Survival of the fittest. It's better for survival if the powerful prey upon the weak, and then that's natural selection. Why can't we kill? We can't kill because every person is made in the image of God. So ultimately, the reason why I can't kill, the reason for commandment 6 is commandment 1. The reason why I can't kill is because God is one and every person is created in the image of God. So that's the connection between 1 and 6. Now we go to 2 and 7. What's number 2? Don't have other gods. What's number 7? Don't commit adultery. Same idea. If you have a relationship with God, don't be distracted by other gods. If you have a relationship with another person, don't commit adultery, don't violate that unity and that relationship between two people, just like you shouldn't violate the relationship and unity between you and God. So that's 2 and 7. Then we go to 3 and 8, the third on each one. What is the third? Do not say God's name in vain. Well, we have to think about why is that so important even? And the other one is don't steal. So the connection between the two is that do not state God's name in vain means that when you take an oath, and you in biblical times they would take an oath with God's name, you should not violate God's name. In other words, it's your moral credibility. Don't violate the moral credibility. When I take an oath in court, and I take an oath and I say God's name, I have to respect that. And in that sense, that allows for do not steal, because if people would steal from each other, in other words, if people steal from each other, it means that they're not respecting their moral obligation to other people. So just to clarify this point, there's a story. I don't know if it's a real story. I don't remember the details, but the story is that there was a thief, and the thief wanted to repent, but he couldn't stop stealing. There's a word, I forget the word of the person who can't stop stealing. In any case, so he comes to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, I want to repent, but I don't think I could stop stealing. The rabbi says, no problem, but you need to make me one promise. What's the promise? You'll always say the truth. You'll always say the truth. Yeah, I'll always say the truth. And I can continue stealing. Yeah, no problem. You can continue stealing. Just promise you'll always say the truth. And then the next night, this gentleman is about to break into a store, and he says, oops, I'm in trouble. He realizes the catch. The catch is that if I steal and the police will come and say, did you steal? I have to say the truth. And if I say the truth, then I'm going to have to confess. So in other words, and that stops him from stealing. In other words, if you're not going to say God's name in vain, in other words, if you're going to respect your word and your moral obligation, then you're not going to steal. So that's how 3 and 8 are connected. Then 4 and 9 are also interesting. 4 and 9 is respect Shabbat, honor Shabbat. Honor the Shabbat. And 9 is do not bear false witness against another person. What's the connection between being Shabbat and bearing false witness? So if you look at the 10 Commandments, there's 2 versions in the way it appears in Deuteronomy and the way it appears here. But here the Torah says, why do we rest on Shabbat? Why? Because God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. What does that mean? It means that as the Talmud says, whoever sanctifies Shabbat is testifying that the world was created by God. You see, what is testimony? Testimony is there's a reality, but not everybody's clear about the reality. We don't know. The reality is vague. We don't know about what happened. So when someone testifies, they shed light and explain to people what happened. So God creates the world, but it was in the past, so nobody knows who created the world. When a Jew sanctifies Shabbat, what the Jew is saying is testimony and revealing the truth that God created the world. So Shabbat is a form of testimony. So if I don't sanctify Shabbat, I am bearing false witness. I'm saying there's no God. I'm saying that the world I'm not expressing the truth of God in the universe. And that's bearing false witness. So that's how 4 and 9 are connected. And finally, we get to the most complicated one, which is do not honor your parents and do not covet what belongs to somebody else. What is the connection? So here there's multiple interpretations. It's not so clear, but I think the interpretation that I like the best is as follows. A person has to honor their parents. Why do you have to honor your parents? Because of what they did good for you? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. What happens if they didn't treat you well? So you don't necessarily, the Torah doesn't say you have to love your parents. That's not what the Torah says. It says honor, give them dignity, give them respect, respect the fact that they are the cause of your creation. Or yes, so we can talk about that. But in any case, even if you did not get the parents you want, even if you did not get the relationship with your parents that you want, even if you did not get the love that you feel that you're probably correct that you're entitled to and you deserve from your parents, you still have to honor your parents. Okay, that's honoring your parents. And then what does do not covet? Why shouldn't I covet? The other person has a fancier yacht than I do. The other person's jet goes farther than mine does. So why shouldn't I covet? So what's the logic of not coveting? The logic of not coveting is not just practical because if I covet, I may come to steal his possessions. No, do not covet because it's a spiritual statement. It's the statement saying that you or I I have everything I need to fulfill my mission. So the other person has more. Maybe that person has more responsibility. Maybe that person has a different mission than I. But I have everything I need to fulfill my mission in life. And therefore, I don't really need anything that the other person has. Because the other person has something else, well, he needs that for his mission. I don't need that for my mission. That's why I don't covet. I don't need it. When I realize that everything I have is tailored for what I need, in other words, everything, all the circumstances I have, all the possessions I have are specific for my mission, and therefore I don't need your stuff because your stuff are tied into your mission, then I understand that what my parents gave me, which is very broad, it's the experience they gave me, but it's also the type of person I am, right? The parents, we inherit from our parents character traits, not just possessions, and not just that we get how they treat us, but also character traits. I say, I wish I was more like somebody else. Why do I have to be like my grandmother or like my father? No, you have to understand that the person you are and the experience you had is critical for your mission in life. And that would lead you both to honor your parents and not to covet what's in your neighbor's house or your neighbor's driveway or in your neighbor's runway. What I'm trying to say here is there's a lot more to say, but to start thinking about the 10 commandments, not just as 10 in a row, but it's 5 by 5 connected. It's almost very hard to have one without the other. It's not clear. Some philosophers would say there could be morality without God, without a higher power. Personally, I humbly disagree. But what do I know? That seems like the Torah is saying these ideas are interconnected. You don't kill because you believe in God. If you don't believe in God, you don't believe in a higher power, maybe slippery slope. Ultimately, it's a slippery slope to your mind. If your mind is the arbitrator of what is moral, that's a dangerous place. So that side to side, mitzvot between God and mitzvot between person and man, one person and another person, they're side by side, they're interrelated, they also are connected. Each one is connected to the other one. Which one is more important? To be a good person to God or a good person to other people? There's not one more important. That's why Moshe spent more money. Kidding. That's why he got 2 tablets to show that it's not one higher than the other. They're parallel. So that's the story in short. A lot more to say. We said a lot. I hope this was enjoyable. I hope, it looks like the sun is not out, but it looks like the snow stopped. So have a wonderful day. Keep warm, but also with the warmth of the Torah. And there's a lot to think about. Thank you for joining. I'm very grateful for everybody participating. And have a wonderful day. And we should see each other in good health.
Fine.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.